Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of The Cheeky Natives. On today's episode, we have Dr Danai Mupotsa. So yes, you've got two black girl doctors on the show today, who I would introduce, but I don't think that there's an introduction that would be sufficient. Suffice to say, Google her and listen to the podcast, and you'll find out exactly why she is somebody to watch out for and to pay attention to. So, hi Danai, welcome to The Cheeky Natives. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you. Hello. Hello everyone. Hello universe who listens to podcasts.
It's a real thing.
Yes.
It's apparently a real thing.
Yeah.
So, Danai, you often introduce yourself as a feminist, and when I was looking you up, because yes, I Googled you, you've been touted as a feminist researcher.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you believe that this is an important introduction to make, like in the first few lines of introducing who Danai Mupotsa is?
I think it was one of the first identities that I owned for myself. I was quite young when I decided I was a feminist. I always thought there was I had feminist ideas, but when I went to university, I was really young. I was 16 when I first arrived, and I went to the US to college, and I get there, I turned 17 in the first couple of days, and I go to a women's studies class, and then we talked about this word, and I was like, yeah, it pretty much summarizes my perspective on things. So I started calling myself that word. It was only when I went to UCT, sort of 6 years later, when I was when I learned the word feminist research, because and I realized a lot of my relationship to feminism was about how we know things, and that learning how we know things, why do we know things we know, how do we know the things that we know, was part of what helped me understand my sense of justice. So I was like, okay, so if you do feminist research, this is what you do. And they literally, I was at the African Gender Institute, so they were like, we call ourselves researchers because we do research and we're going to practice. So I started describing myself as a feminist researcher then. I didn't know I would have a career in research at the time. I thought I was going to end up with a real job, in the world. I didn't know I'd be an academic then, but I knew that I was someone who did feminist research.
So you also lecture in African literature.
Mm-hmm.
Is there an interplay between the feminism that you describe and the career path that you've chosen to undertake?
Yeah, I think so. I think it came together really easily. Once I decided to do a PhD, then at that point I was like, okay, so I'm not going to have a normal job. And a lot of people, actually, a lot of my close friends thought I shouldn't do it in African literature because they were worried about what job I would have. So I was like, choose something like anthropology or politics. But it was important to do it in African literature and take the risk because I wanted to, well, partly because of who I wanted to supervise me, but also because I've never had a disciplinary training. I never had because I was always in women gender studies or African studies. So it didn't matter to me. It mattered to me that it's a place that is at the heart of the question is something about power. And that's what African literature represents for me. It's about thinking about worlds and perspectives and ways and forms of writing and imagining and asking questions of justice and power, and that for me is explicitly feminist work. So that's it was a natural fit, I think.
So take us through the journey. So where did you grow up? How did you land up in the US and now you're in Cape Town? I'm on a journey.
I was like a journey. No, so I was born in Harare. I was the oldest child of 3 girls who followed. And my parents, when I was about 7 years old, my father took a job in Botswana in a sort of on a building site, which I think is a secret American Air Force base. So they were building this base, and we lived on this site with a bunch of people from all over the world. I remember it was a very small school, a class. I remember in standard 3 there were 3 of us, and at the time, so we were in this kind of fantasy life of people from all over the world to build this thing, engineers, architects, sort of that kind of human. Weird domestic arrangements of men who do kind of machinic work, and their wives who were forced to quit their jobs to come be with them in this expatriate community. So we were there until my mum was she wanted to have a career again. So she, at some point close to my father's contract ending, we traveled back and lived with my grandmother in Braeside in Harare and then eventually my father returned, and then I went to high school in Zim. My parents were really hard on me about schoolwork, especially my dad. So that's how I ended up in the US, because for O-levels, I got 9 A's and 2 B's. I can say it out loud. No, my father had hoped I would have gotten 13 A's. So first of all, he's like, you didn't do enough subjects, and then you got these 2 B's. So he was quite disappointed by these kind of mediocre grades.
Wow.
And he expressed it, so I was really afraid of disappointing him. So when it came to A-levels, I was like, what if I get a B? And so I did my SATs and I applied to go to college in the US, because I was like, let me not disappoint him with my A-level results. So that's how I ended up being quite young and in the US. I thought I was going to be a doctor, like the medical kind. So I was going to be biochem, and then I was sitting in these classrooms. There were 2 stories that happened. First, they told the story of reproduction, and it was like this egg was waiting for the sperm to like pop it open, and I was like, doesn't sound like science, it sounds like a story, and like a weird patriarchal one. And then this man was talking about the difference between the European bee and the African bee, and the one was naturally violent, and I was like, again, that sounds like a story and not science. And so I started thinking about how science itself was full of narrative forms, and often they were suited to kind of things around race and class and gender. And so the dream of being a doctor failed soon because I was like, what is this? But also I started doing this thing where I'd register for a course at the beginning of the semester, and then I would go for the first week, and like political science courses, I'd go see if the books all had an American flag on the front, and then I would leave that class, or I'd walk into a class and they'd have the person be like, would all the international students like tell me where you're from, and you'd have to tell some story of your African country. And so I started realizing right away how I operate in the world. Like, these people see me as so an African student can play a particular kind of both victim, agent, but also operates in the assumption that you've come here and you would never want to leave this country. There was lots of things going on. So I became a little bit politicized quite quickly, and it was like, so I didn't sit in those classes where the books had American flags on the cover. And you'd be surprised how many people think that's a normal thing. And I started becoming much more, I think I was always attentive to the work of nationalism. I'd always been really suspicious of Shona cultural nationalism, having grown up in Zim. People continue to think it's normal, and I've always been like, but I think, in a nation where we don't talk about sort of language as difference, we don't talk about gender as difference, there's a kind of seamless, all happy family around this kind of fantasy of Shona cultural life, as though that doesn't have a history of itself, and it hasn't produced massive effects of violence, and also doesn't naturalize massive kind of structures of power. Essentially there's a caste system around labor and domestic labor that no one talks about because it's just the way it should be.
And it's the way it's always been.
Exactly. And so I think it's not that being in America sort of made me more politicized. It just was like, wow, it gave me a language of comparison to begin to be like, oh wow, the countries I've lived in have been a little bit terrible. In these kinds of ways, because now I'm one that's especially terrible and affects the world in such radical ways, but in fact this is a pattern of how nations work.
So I'm curious about, you've spoken about it in a few panels that you've attended about feminism in an African context and its subsequent scholarship, right? As a research, as an area of research. But what about, there's arguments that have been made about whether feminism truly applies to black women on this continent in the context in which black women operate for whatever reason that people have felt that way. But what do you think of its existence for black women in reading and writing and documenting about themselves? Particularly just because the Cheeky Natives is interested in black literature as an act of survival and of archiving our stories and our realities without that white gaze that seems to just be forever present. And that even influences the way that we speak about ourselves and to each other, and the way in which we perform for certain
There's a
audiences.
ghost there always waiting to watch you and tell you.
And you're always so conscious, right? It's like you're always so conscious. You're like, you want to say, oh, that's so black, and you're like, I'll wait for when I'm with my black friends. Because you're so very aware of the places, of the audiences that you find yourself in. So I'm quite curious about feminism in that respect.
I think for me it's like anytime you have a chance to reflect on yourself, on your life, there's an opportunity to raise one's level of consciousness. So space and time to do any active reflection, whether it's a conversation with another person where you realize that something you thought was like something was that you were doing wrong that was producing an effect in your life, and then you realize, wait a minute, but you're also, and then you get to think about it as structural or as about power. It's not about you. It's like, oh no, that thing that happened, something as simple as an action. I was talking to someone earlier today, and they were talking about the moment they realize when someone pushes your head down for in an act, during some part of a sexual act, and having to come to terms of being like, no, that's not okay, but also this is a pattern of behavior that's not about me. It's not like I'm the one who was living my life in my house and was inviting people to push my head down. But even, and then becoming aware that that's not okay. Also, then you have to reimagine all of a range of experiences in your past. So there's something that is animated in reflecting with another person when you realize that you share an experience with someone, and then you can have the language to say, no, that wasn't okay. And of course, then there's lots of work involved in trying to think about your life when you become awake and aware of things that are wrong. But for me, it's like, the time and the space to, if you think about this generation, the sort of early generations of African women writers, what all they did was to write the lives of women and the home. To think about the letters in sort of so long a letter Miriamaba, and to think about friendship and as a space of sharing experiences. It literally performs the gesture. We share our experience of something, and then I get my longing, my loss, my pain, and then you're able to not only form a solidarity with another person, but by sharing that experience, you raise your level of awareness, both of you, about what is not about. It's not about you, even if it is about you, and then you're able to then say, okay, so if it's not about me, then how can I mobilize myself and others to change what's happening in this dynamic? And so I think there's absolutely a connection between the time for reflection and the time for action. I think they happen, they spark, they animate each other in really important ways.
So yesterday I had a massive debate with somebody who felt that the men are trash movement. I'm rolling my eyes. I wish everyone could see this. So the argument goes, she says that when women say men are trash and then leave it at that, they really haven't done much.
Wow.
And then I clutched my pearls for a little bit, and I was like, oh, what? And I guess the real question for me was, what kind of action would they have then desired from women? Because from my just lived experience, that the act of feminism itself is an action, right? Do you believe, so then we had a further argument, and she's like, no, you should educate these men.
Because it's our job to educate them.
So how are you, so that actually, so when I had that conversation in mind, and I was just like, oh, Jesus, take the wheel. Like, Jesus, take the wheel.
Take the wheel and make this happen.
Steer this in the right direction, you know, because I think we've seen a rise in how feminism is for everybody, right? But how are you navigating that space between the ideals, because that was the idea that we were talking about, the ideals of what things should be and the current states of what they actually are.
So I have two ways of thinking, two answers. So in first, when something like men are trash, for me, when things happen and they produce intensity, like Me Too, men are trash, for me it's always interesting to also think about the effects and affects of that thing. I think we've been so trained, and it's really unimaginative. We think of things, in very good, bad, sort of very stark ways. There's no room for something to produce meanings that are inconclusive. So for example, then you say this, and then what? As though there could be, in this kind of assumption that when we point to a problem, unless we can solve it in a very sort of simple way or a very direct way, or I can give you like a policy frame for the problem. To point to the problem makes you the problem because you haven't solved the problem, as though that's the only way we have to ask questions when things might be ongoing and unanswerable, but also something might produce meanings that themselves. So if Men Are Trash has enabled us to have a large conversation about patriarchy, about individual perpetrators of patriarchal actions, but also about thinking about patriarchy as a system and as a structure that produces these kinds of effects. For me, there can be lots of meanings that we read in that situation that aren't about fixing or at least pretending to fix. We like to do these conclusions. It's like, now we've concluded
Yes.
and we fixed it. So that's one answer. But on the other hand, so speaking as a teacher, and across the board of whatever I teach, there's always an extent to which what I'm teaching, I mean, pedagogically, I approach the act of teaching through a kind of feminist praxis, which involves lots of things, but also the content is nothing that I don't think anyone can teach in a not feminist way. So if I have, for example, men, hit men in my class, but also all of us. I mean, there's so many. If we're thinking about questions of power in a dense way, we're thinking about class in a really important way. We're thinking about questions around ability, around the general assumptions we make about what it means to even just hold your body, how to occupy a seat, to do the act of listening and participating in a classroom. There's lots of things that are ongoing. So how to bring feminist lessons into a course, something I'm always thinking about. So sometimes it's the content, it's the shape of questions, it's not assuming that everybody has the same language. So knowing that I'm always learning new languages. I think I once wrote something about when I was in college. I wrote an article about learning feminism is like learning a new language. Like even for me, the ones were like, I put in a kind of an online test. What is women with an X? Because now someone knows and they woke, and the other one doesn't know, and they're being called non-inclusive. But where does the need for the term come from? What is the effect of using it? Is it alienating? Does it describe everyone's understanding of how to be inclusive? What are other acts of what does inclusive actually mean? How do we do actions that are inclusive, but also know that being inclusive might always be the most transformative way to shift, So I think those questions can appear in any kind of course content, right? And so then for me, there's the actions of feminist teaching are the actions of allowing people in the classroom to all know what they bring to the classroom, which is knowledge, to know what they bring to the classroom, which is not just in their head, but also in the body, and how the body also carries its own meanings, its own knowledge, its own judgments. It also is about a kind of a valuing of the generation of questions that people bring. Even if it's like, I want to disagree, I'm like, yes, let's disagree in a way that that has the integrity to care for what the other person is saying. There are times I'm sitting and someone is saying something like wasting time to do something weird and patriarchal in a classroom, and I always have to think of my position and role. I don't always get it right, because sometimes it happened recently. It was with a friend. I said, but it was like in that kind of context where I know if I say this, even if I'm right, there's something where my authority undermines all of what that other person knows, even if they're wrong. So how to negotiate that interaction in a way to say, maybe it's not okay for this to continue in the space. Like, we're not going to have some weird kind of hotepish rape explaining conversation right now, because I'm not going to facilitate that. But of course, I'm not going to tear you apart for that, because that there's nothing. I'm not invested in destroying you. I'm invested in us having a conversation that can help us flourish in our questions of power.
Speaking of conversations, I think as a feminist researcher, and as someone who's been described as a radical feminist, I have lots of feelings about the description of women as radical anything. Yeah. And this is just an aside. It comes from a conversation we had earlier on the podcast, in which I actually asked a woman, I was like, you've been described as someone radical and whatever, and she said she rejects that. And I was shocked. I'm like, what do you mean you reject that? It's so great. You're thought to be this groundbreaking thing. And I mean, she highlighted the fact that firstly, when we use words like radical in relation to women, it almost always has a negative connotation, right? So men can be passionate, men can be thought to be even aggressive, but nobody ever sees that as a negative trait. When women are advocating for basic human rights like feminism, suddenly there's something radical about the idea that women, the other half of this world, have the rights to equal pay. Something as basic as that somebody who is as qualified as you, who just happens to perhaps have not even a different set of gender skills, that even falls in the idea of binary thinking, but who identifies as women is somehow disadvantaged by that. but also just moving on to the question, how do you have these difficult conversations in ways which don't then require you to be a mule? Because I tend to find that people want you to educate them without necessarily having done the work of self-education. So we can understand that when it relates to white people and race, and why people can write books about why they're no longer to speaking about race to white people. Someone give me that book. Just put it out there. But not understand why black feminists might feel some type of way about having to explain to hoteps. How do you navigate that space?
I think my answer changes all the time. I like the word radical. I used to use it all the time. Like, when I was younger, I always stop being like, I am a, because I think it's like a thing that happens in one's becoming feminist. You keep naming yourself. But for me, it's important. I take the point about why is it radical, but it's important to locate myself within histories. And so when I say radical, I'm signaling radical traditions in feminism, in LGBTI organizing, and also in the Black radical tradition, which is a very specific way of saying I'm located in I believe in a practice that radically doesn't amend the system, but radically wants to pull it apart. So for me, it's about citing a tradition or a set of traditions, albeit I always do everything undutifully, but to cite that tradition, say there's a radical dismantling of a system. But I do take also the point that people go around calling themselves activist or radical as
economic. Pick your word. Pick your word today.
In the left tradition, an activist doing this. So I also take the way that there's a particular kind of power that's animated in claiming to do something radical when you're like, no, you're still living in a suburb, in land zoned in problematic ways, living in earning a salary in institutional structures that are messed up. So it's one of those. It's in the mouth but out the mouth, because of course to claim the tradition when you live in ways that are complicit with the system is problematic to me. But how to. For me, it changes all the time. So there's times when I literally walked out of a presentation because I was watching someone behave so badly. I was at a conference on a panel on Somali studies, and there was this older white woman who's there like, look at my 13th book on Somali culture. I'm the expert, and there's a problem in this thing called Somali studies. It's a problem in area studies in general. We can say that, but there's this field called Somali studies. There was a scandal a few years ago when the principal journal of Somali studies, the board of it was all European and white, I think with some North Americans, but they're certainly all white, no Somali academics on it. And then someone had said there's a problem with this, and there's a lot of flourishing. There's a flourishing, I was gonna say market as though that's normal, but there's a lot of young, but also not young, Somali academics producing work across different disciplines who very much could have been considered for a board position, but also I think as a question of power and representation should have been. But this German academic answers and says, no, there's no Somalis good enough for this, etc. We are the ones, the authority. And
we are the authority.
This is the problem in African studies in general, because it's been this thing where people from outside of African contexts study African areas, right? And it's inherited. So even if one is doing it in South Africa, you learn the method of subjecting Zimbabwe to some kind of ethnographic gaze that is often not based on. So it's always a discovery mode. It's like, I discovered a band, as though that is knowledge.
And that's violence.
Yeah. I mean, methodologically it's impoverished, but it's like there's no. If you weren't discovering it and it was already there, what other kinds of questions or angles could you think about this object, this question, that don't reduce it to everybody sits and watches the discovery of something new,
which exists.
So for me, I change all the time in terms of, so sometimes I'm like, I walk out in that situation where someone is like talking endlessly and ignored the work of two really brilliant young Somali academics. One was like an economist, and the other she was sort of more cultural studies and did this really amazing sort of same as almost performance piece, because she went through this kind of song called and response that was like sort of communal song, but also with sort of poetry, but also doing sort of some serious analytical work about the question of memory and language and diasporic identity. So of course people would pose questions to these two people. I don't remember the economist one. Apparently I didn't enjoy his as much as I enjoyed this woman's work. But people are posing questions to them after ignoring a very problematic presentation by this other woman who had basically been like, you know how Somalis are, you know, their tribes, like, it wasn't just that she claimed authority. Her presentation was riddled with really problematic stereotypes, full-on straight-up racist, problematic, but also continuously affirming her own authority in the area, as particularly as someone who's different and isn't inside, so she can see. I can really see how you people are. So the chair takes questions and people just ignored her, and so she insists on answering their questions because her voice must be reinserted. And in that instance, so I got up eventually because I was like, the chair needs to set to act and make this person be shut up. Like, this is violent to me, but it's also, it's not okay as a practice of a conversation, because we're assuming to be polite and to allow this is the polite thing to do, but this is committing a violence on one. So I got up and I made a huge fuss. I dropped things on the ground and I walked out. So sometimes I react like this. And sometimes I'm extremely charming. And I try to generously participate in conversations, even if the other person, what they bring is only the force of the authority that their body carries in relation to mine. And some people do that all the time, as this woman did. My authority comes with the privilege of my body, and I will continue to use it. And so sometimes in those conversations, I try to you know, so I find conversations with like uncle-like figures really difficult, because it takes me to painful places, my personal. But sometimes I'll be like, there was a conference I was at last year where this older man yelled, "Hey, South Africa!" I think he was referring to me, but I was now South Africa. I became the country, and I'd seen him at this conference 4 years before. And at that conference, my friend and colleague and my beloved had said to me, "Learn how to make acquaintances. You don't have to love everybody, make some acquaintances. These are like professional contacts who you don't have to like, but you are able to have polite conversations." This is one of the people I've been forced to make an acquaintance. So now the person sees me, the group of sort of uncle age men. "Hey, South Africa!" So I turn to him, and he goes, and then he turns to them and he says, "Do you know this naughty girl?" So now I'm a naughty girl. I'm both South Africa and a naughty girl, and there's something that he's trying to signal, both in marking me as a country in the south of Africa, as well as a naughty girl, that is meant to be some kind of meaning that's happening about Southern African women, and something I'm familiar with, having been a Southern African who lived in the US, for example. People always be like, "You South Africans are so slutty," and so I know what he's trying to signal, and he's in calling me a girl. So, and these men all just like, oh, like, hey, 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 and no one says anything like anything's wrong with this, right? I should have lost my mind, but I didn't. Actually, I think I remember thinking, I'm really tired, and I cannot get involved in this conversation, so I just walked away. But I mean, oof. And that's a conversation with somebody whose body carries more authority than me, but he certainly still felt the need to reduce me to a girl in order to engage with me, because actually he can't engage with me on an intellectual conversation basis.
So problematic.
Can you imagine?
Which leads me to my next question. So there's and I really hope everyone can get this. You talk about, there's a book by Sarah Ahmed, Living a Feminist Life, which you contributed to the analysis post that. And you crafted a response with 5 love letters, and you spoke about fragility, companions, feminism as pedagogy, manifestos, and dedication. Do you remember?
Yes, I
do. And then you talk about how you're tired of being a feminist killjoy, and I was snapping my fingers because I read this when I was at work. I was like, yes, this is me. And feeling like the mean one. And this is a recurring theme for me. I really like unlikable women. I really, really like unlikable women. Just as a topic of interest, I think that as Black women particularly, we've been socialized to believe that until you are lying flat on the ground and people are walking over you and still complaining that you're not flat enough, you are not a nice woman. You know, so if you're opinionated and you have beliefs and you're quite clear on them, you're not a nice woman. And so nice is often being weaponized in the way in which people relate with Black women. And so women who are unlikable or who are killjoys are very interesting to me. Why do you feel that it's such a burden to feel like the mean one?
I think it's because, you know, when first of all, people already, you carry this body, so people always think they know what you're going to say. The number of times I put my hand up to say something and people were like, the gender question. And I'm like, you know.
I love that you said that. I had that incident last week at work. I'm like, I wasn't going to say
what
anything.
Is the gender question? And why is it one question? You know, it's like, no, I didn't interview women, sorry. I'm like, why are you answering me as though I've already spoken? I haven't spoken yet. There was an incident, you know, and it's produced, and there's a huge fund on this project now that I hope the questions are more complex. I remember specifically having a conversation. It was about after the City Opera had performed at Brown, and I'd been there for a workshop. I was a PhD student at the time, and they performed Figaro, which is all framed around the master-slave dialectic, and they reconfigured it to show to the present, to show black men beating black women. So it was about gender-based violence as the new master-slave dialectic. And so I asked this white opera director, after he's made us in an American context watch black people beat each other, you know, perform violence to each other. You know, I said, this is about the master-slave dialectic. You said it on a wine farm in the Cape. That seems like a place that continues to produce the very economy of the dialectic you speak of. And I'm not discounting the prevalence of gender-based violence, but there's something a little bit problematic about you directing these young black people to produce a show in this context that shows South Africa as a context of black men beating black women, which is not to say that I don't fight, gender-based violence in that form as it appears, and often it does. But that's, for me, there's something that's extremely racist happening here. Yeah. And I didn't even use the word racist. I tried to really work within the language of the opera around Figaro. This person literally the way this has been translated, the story, I've heard it retold when people don't know that it was me who asked the question. The way that story was, first of all, this man reached, when
you hear stories about yourself,
he reaches for a chair to throw at me. So this man had a physical reaction to my question, right? I had to apologize to him as the person who would, but also the way the story gets retold every time is though they're like, some black woman said that black people can't do opera, and I'm like, that's not what I said. So you know, you do
it grows
you do this whole question. I was like, I went to really hard work to think through a specific piece of work that was presented to me and to ask a question about race and power. And the only thing you heard, because I'm a black woman asking it, is can black people do opera? And so you robbed me of the integrity of my intellectual question, which was a very good one. You robbed me of my intellect. You robbed me of actually what I'm trying to tell you, but also you can't. And sometimes I feel like people can't actually hear what I'm saying, because they answer you like they know
exactly what you're going to ask.
It's like they know you, and they know that the only thing that you could be asking is, you haven't spoken about the women, you haven't included a black, so it's like, and like, yes, that's a very obvious question, but that's not the one I'm asking. And also people don't know how to admit. I'm like, I'm a very smart woman. Some people don't understand what I'm saying because it's very complicated, and they don't want to say, I don't understand. So instead of saying, I don't understand, and I reach a limit, can you say it in a way that I can understand what you're saying? It's like, no, there's something wrong with you. And then people get angry. You lift your chair. So you're angry at me because I've used my intellect, and you react with your body, and I'm the irrational one.
I'm just shook at him having lifted his chair.
Yeah.
And everybody else in the room was, because my question becomes...
And then he asked these young black people to say, you tell her that you love the opera, you tell her how I took you out the township. That's how he answered me. So first of all, they must defend opera because I've attacked opera in general. I'm like, no, I've asked you a question about the production you showed us. But all he hears is, she says you can't do opera. She says there's nothing in opera for you. And then she says that domestic violence doesn't happen in South Africa. I'm like, yes, I'm aware it happens in South Africa, but let's move on to something that's more nuanced. Don't give me fucking cliches. Give me an answer to my question. Nothing. But now they must answer. So instead of him answering the question, he forces them to defend opera, which they do, because this is their teacher, this is their director, this is the person who has authority over them and their careers, and but also they love what they do. Of course they're going to defend it. And I'm like, but that's not the point. That wasn't my question.
And also the idea that whenever we have crisis in this country, regardless of who owns the company, there'll always be like a black person who has to come out and speak to the workers, and then reassure everybody that, we have our people under control. And it always feels like a secondary violence, right? That you can create these kind of crazy messes that implode and then believe that black people somehow owe you ramification, or we owe you the remedying of those kind of situations. And I think it's so interesting that you've spoken about how people sort of assume the things that they think you're going to say. So I'm at work, we're having chats about people sometimes you should just not talk about things at work. I'm learning this.
Yes. Just, like, keep to yourself.
I'm just like, let's talk about
that article. Like, look, ask for the Wi-Fi password. Don't ask people to talk to you.
Just talk about the patients.
Yes.
Don't be talking about socioeconomic things. No, just you're here. No. And we discuss, someone was getting married. So the discussion then moves on to, changing their surnames or whatever. So I'm keeping quiet this whole time. I'm like, I don't have anything to contribute. So the conversation continues. I mean, I've now kept quiet because I think my politics are quite clear. I'm quite clear even at work. Everybody knows, and I'm just quiet. I'm like, not today, Satan, not today. So everybody goes. So this boy goes around. This white boy goes around asking everybody. So, will you change your surname, whatever? I'm still like, I will not be drawn into these things. I'm just gonna mind my own business. Then he turns around and he says, Alma, will you be changing your surname when you get married? So I say, no, I won't. And I don't justify, I don't explain, I just say no, I won't.
Yeah, and then already.
He's like, oh, of course, I knew you wouldn't. No discussion, no. He literally turned around to my colleague, who's also a white male, and was like, I knew she wouldn't. And completely excluded me from this conversation that they were having. And I just felt some type of way. But it was also this idea that people believe, and I guess it also goes to the idea of the ideas we have about feminism and what we think feminism looks like, right? So think that we have very basic ideas. We haven't done the work to fully excavate some ideas about feminism. So we believe that feminism is for everybody, and looks a certain way for everybody. We haven't gone beyond what it looks like to be for everybody. And the idea that somebody could completely reduce your feelings on a certain topic to being, I knew you would be that one, and that happens to black women all the time, that if you happen to be a black woman with a smidgen of an opinion, it'll be late for you. You will always be branded as a firecracker, or you're problematic, or you're the mean one, you're the vocal one. You just have too much to say.
We knew you'd say that.
We knew you'd say that, as though there's no thinking, or there's no discourse to the ideas or the principles that you hold. You arrived at those feelings because you're that one. And
I heard someone I know said to some people, "Oh, is she even fuckable?"
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's first of all, if that's how you understand a sexual relation, there's another whole conversation to be had. But I'm like, wow. I mean, so the idea that I'm self-possessed, I mean, maybe that's what it means. I'm like, no, I'm not fuckable, actually.
Yeah, and maybe we must have discussions about the power dynamics in which you want to only believe that you could ever sleep with a woman whose neck you have your boots against, and there's no way you could find a woman who self-articulates and self-actualizes as being.
But that statement is also made to reduce you, first of all, to someone to like. So it's both an action of saying, oh, this one is so like this that they're not fuckable, but also it's meant to reduce you to someone who can only be described in that relation because they're not willing to deal with you as a person with ideas, as a person of principles, a certain. So let me actually reduce you to someone who I can only relate to. You're a woman, so why are you not fuckable?
Because that's all women exist for. Yeah. I mean, so you have a paper about gender and language in sub-Saharan Africa, and you talk about, you're cited on the paper. About tradition and struggle in feminism. And then there's an article you wrote about the praxis of lobola. And I thought, in light of everything that's happened with Ingleba and sort of the discussions around cultural practices and the way in which people get so defensive, what are your feelings on the conversations we should be having around tradition and sort of this, I don't want to say stagnancy, but the lack of dialogue and the lack of discourse that happens around certain traditions existing in the current formats. And I think Ingleb has brought that up so much, right? People that you thought were like rational, thinking or providing receipts, and I'm just like,
you're
like Jesus, why?
Why are you like this? I think, a lot of the ways we'll talk about tradition, it's as though it doesn't change. It changes all the time. It is constantly evolved. It evolves fast. It evolves as fast as our language evolves, which is all the time. We're constantly making up words, changing words, cutting words, repeating them with new meaning all the time. And tradition does exactly the same thing. But there's something about cultural power around certain things that people are not willing to accept, right? And that's often, for me, when people are resistant to that transformation, it's not about the actual tradition, it's about power. So what people are responding to is a refusal to deal with the question of power, and people who have power don't easily give it up, so we have to take it. So for me, it's very simple. I'm acting within tradition to tell you to fuck off. I'm acting within the very language
feminist
of tradition to say, what you're talking about is power, it's not tradition. And I want to take my power, but also because you're not giving me land unless I come and get it. You're not giving me power unless I'm like, no, this is mine. So for me, I've had, because a lot of my work begins with my personal experience, the piece on the wall, and also my PhD I did about marriage, but I was getting married, and then by the end of it I was divorced. And people called me selfish, like straight up and down, like, you are selfish, like, why you've subjected a person to an entire marriage for research. And of course that's not what happened. What happened was I entered a process of a relationship with someone, and as I became more and more unhappy and more aware of how we understood that institution, and also aware of my own naiveness of thinking that an institution could just be about two people, you crazy. No, it's an institution. It's about legal arrangements of property, legal arrangements of that property, at least encased in that law, is about the status of the woman as property also, not just through the wala, but also in a civil marriage, the way that law is written, coming out of Roman Dutch kind of interpretations, you were always a relation of property, so even if we have laws that say one is an individual, not a minor, there are those laws as carrying institutions, as carrying practices and relations of power, continue to produce the language of reducing women to status of property in relation to another person. And so for me, to us to be able to say, to observe enough times and say to think about how marriage works, to think about the forms of becoming man and becoming woman that are produced, at least I was looking at heterosexual marriage and the ways the institution demands, it demands a diminishing, it demands, it demands practicing roles that some people can flourish in. I mean, there's lots of things about domesticity that I flourish in sometimes. I was like, when I was in divorce, my therapist, who's just recently passed away, I remember saying to her, but like, there's things I like, that I brought in, like play, acting, sort of domesticities, but I'm not willing to subject to it as a relation of power. And she was like, well, no, how do you find ways of, you cook because you love to cook and you love to eat and you love to feed others, as you love to flourish the body and to flourish other people's bodies and to care for, but how do we have human relations or not, where those forms of generosity and giving to each other, even between like lovers, between co-parents, between friends, where we can learn to love each other in ways that forms of reciprocity aren't so attached to meanings of and relations of power. And I don't think that these institutions are a lot of the ways we have to fix it. Therapy, marriage therapists and blah blah blah. And there's an entire institutions built around saving these institutions because they matter politically, because they produce relations of power. They produce elites, social elites who are two as one person. They produce
very significant others.
Yes,
because
they
you are insignificant on your
social
own.
mobilities. They produce all sorts of things. They produce senses of safety because I mean, the unsafety of living in a home alone as a single mother, for example. They produce there's lots of effects and affects that privileging certain forms of couplehood produce for other people, majority of whom are not in those forms of couplehood. But there's also lots of unsafety within those relations because people don't talk about marital rape. They don't define it. They don't name it. They feel bad and impolite if you say, my husband raped me, there's something wrong with you, like you don't love him, right? There's all these things that happen. So for me, I just finished the first chapter of the book and sent it to the publishers last week, and in the first chapter is against love, and it's like, how do I think about a form of love that is radically against, not even radically against, but because I'm like, I can love my parents and what they have done and how they've survived and managed and worked through and how they understand institutions and relations, and my grandparents and my siblings and my friends. How can I have a dense love for people who participate in social systems that are deeply damaging to themselves and others, and know that this is the language they speak, and also say, but actually there are other loves. There are loves that aren't like this.
Do you think that so someone was asking, okay, so this was going on Twitter about how to date men as feminist women, just as women, right, is an extreme sport, right? Because it's an extreme sport to date men.
I don't date men anymore. Or I mean, at least not side gender ones. I don't know. I haven't thought about women in general, but I at some point was like, why am I doing this? I don't enjoy this. I don't enjoy having sex with them. Like, what am I doing besides that? I think that I can. I didn't. I mean, as in I can do it. It's slightly self-harming because I don't enjoy it, and why am I doing self-harming things? But I, the things we learn heterosexual scripts from so young, they're so powerfully communicated to us, that when it comes to, until you come against the wall that says, no, this is not my life, why am I doing this? It feels natural because from the minute you're like,
conditioned.
They're like, see that little boy, and you're like, this is a 6-month-old. Why is the 6-month-old being encouraged to see, last week in my daughter's school, she's in an all-girls school, they went to a boys' school for Valentine's Day. I'm like, what craziness is that? These people are 8. Why are they already being conditioned to imagine that this is a day that means you go meet? So there's something so ongoing about the way we are socialized into heterosexuality that, so it's a sport because you have to be endlessly prepared to be disappointed. It's not a fun.
Disappointed or insulted,
hopeful, and then anticipating heartache. And I don't mind even that structure of relation because it's like, actually at least it's dynamic. It produces some But
how do you navigate then the politics? I think especially for women,
you have to explain to raise someone's child to be this is not an appropriate thing to do to another person,
because it's exactly that, right? It's the idea that you must,
like, why are you dating pushing people's heads down for
what is wrong with you? You need to stop.
People, I was like, wow, when I heard that story this morning, I was like, we need a sexual rehabilitation.
No, we do,
because people are out there in the world thinking that's normal and thinking that was romantic love.
Now you're feeling your tracks moving on your head, like,
and you're like, what are you?
What's going on? What's going on?
But of course, imagine like in high school when you're learning to have sex and you've got your peers who you're learning to have sex, and everyone is talking, and there's something I remember. That's why I'm interested in female friendships, and something about the way we learn to be friends with each other, and we wrap around practicing heterosexuality, imposing it on each other. Let's all go out as friends to seek out romantic partners. So we practice forms of femininity that normalize really violent things. I remember with my friends and I in high school sneaking out the house to go meet these boys, and part of the whole night. So you sneak out your house to go drink with these people to eventually pair up in some kind of way, and then do some kind of public, because we're all together, weird sex acts, and so I'm like, how is this social life? But this is what we did, right? And you watch something happen to someone where the next morning someone is literally cut in their vagina because this person was rough, and so there's something about what happened, and we're all there, we're all complicit, we all participate, and there's something wrong, and then it's like, oh, why didn't you say something? But also, why is this person dealing with your vagina in such a violent way that they're ripping you? And why?
That's an act of domination.
Not even, it's just, it might just be clumsy, like a clumsy idiot teenage boy, but there's something that none of us were like, let's talk about this not being a way to do social life. Why, so let's talk about, maybe someone didn't want to be paired up. Sometimes they used to be the phrase, take one for the team. Like, look, if there's like, now we've paired up and now you're left with this one, or find that you're the one who must sleep with the uncle so that we can get transport home, or like naturalizing, so that of course we have really violent ideas about how sex should be, because it's rooted in how female friendships work, where it becomes like, you may just be strong and learn to move on, but also if you didn't individually defend yourself, but also this, and in the
language that is used around it, right? It's like, can also just be so violent. So even when people describe sexual acts like, yeah, I would thump that, I hit that, it always feels like so domineering. Like, why being hit in sex? Like, why are you thumping that
in an act that is discussed and shared but understood, perhaps, but like not like this is what sex is.
As such a violent act of dominion. And I think that there's some real conversations that need to happen, particularly around around sex and desire for black women. You know, I think we can tell that black women are having sex. I think that communities like to behave as though young black women don't have sex, you know, but we've got proof that the opposite of that happens. People are having lots of sex. We've got a healthy population, you know. And the idea that there's all these taboos related to sex is something that's just so interesting for me, that we can be such a conservative country but have behavior that completely reflects the opposite of all these conservative ideals that we claim to hold. And why is that an area of sort of interest or research for you?
For me, it was like where my questions of justice came from. I was like, what is this friendship that looks like this? How is it connected to the fact that, you know, you're watching these women, like, you know, like insisting on a marriage because it means someone chose you, but you know this person has. I'm not valorizing monogamy, but if you're in a non-monogamous relationship, you must also be aware of it. And if you are aware of it, but to be aware of it hurts you, then that's not, you know what I mean?
That's not your portion.
That's, you know, and why is it only your monogamy and not the other person's? You know, these are questions that I don't know what space there is within female friendships there is to discuss those things, because the polite thing to do as a good friend is to be there when someone wants to cry, but you don't bring it up again, right? Because then you're undermining my respectability, you're undermining my relationship, you're undermining.
We've moved on. Why are you still saying this? The public work I do,
we moved on. So, for me, my work comes from those questions. Like, I'm like, I feel like, you know, I want my friendships to be harder, to demand harder work. Even if I've had friends who have been terrible to partners, for example, you know, and I'm watching it and I'm like, no, even that question I'm also asking. I'm not saying then you only, you know, with your friends you're like, this is my squad, so everybody else is screwed.
Squad goals.
But it's like, what are the forms? For me, it's like, what are the forms? I've been trying to practice this, however clumsily. Of course, we all fail. We've been raised in this world where we inherit all sorts of trauma and all sorts of bad language and all sorts of assumptions and all sorts of. So, you know, so we're all clumsy. But how do you make the space available to say, for me, I want forms of relationship with others that are based on some integrity to myself, and that requires the hard work of that integrity to myself, but also how do I understand the boundaries, the baggage, of another person? How do I not impose a fantasy of something up to this relation with another person, no matter what kind of relationship that is, that isn't based upon what I think is the, you know. So if your friendship is based upon you thinking you're the kind of person who needs to be in a book club, that's fantasy. It's a projection of yourself in the world. But the extra question would be, how does it animate? How does it feed your imagination? How does it feed your pleasure? How does it bring joy that gives a sense of meaning? And how does that relationship with the other person, besides simply performing that I have friends, you know, what are the other things that, you know, how does it spiritually pull you apart from yourself and draw you back? You know, I think for me, my work has been trying to understand the ways that we project so much fantasy about who we should be in the world onto the way we actually practice ourselves and our relationships with other people. That it's and no one, I mean, not no one, but it's, I think, the really hard work of self-healing and self-learning disappears from most of the ways we have relationships, because the relationship surviving and enduring is enough of a goal to be like, I did it, and like, oh, congratulations, I persevered. But how are you fed by this? How are you growing by this? How are you healed by this? And then there's all these quick get fixed quickly, you know, things that, you know, help people move along, but
not quite.
And I'm like, so me, I'm like, okay, so how do I build work that practices that for myself? Because that's what I decided how I want to live. I want to project a life to my child. I did the irresponsible thing of bringing her into the universe. I need to equip her with the tools to hold on to what's magic about it, because most of what we do in the world rips that away. The shine is all, you know, we dull the shine because I'm angry at Pick and Pay, because the woman who's angry at Pick and Pay who's serving me, she smiled at the white lady before me, now she's mad at me, and now I'm mad at her. But I'm like, I should have a better response to this. But also, why must I always be the one smiling at you when you're not smiling at me, because I'm not a white lady? And, you know, and there's so much that was so much we rub against. So of course, to live in a world where you feel, when the world is so terrible, It's hard, but then we can, for me it's like, okay, let me find tools. How do I find tools? And part of the tools is say, okay, we need some kind of plan for justice where this woman isn't mad about her minimum wage pay and doesn't
long hours
and long hours and
apartheid spatial architecture that means that she'll get home and her children are bed.
But still also she's somehow learned to value this customer more than
me, right? Even though we both have smart shopper cards and I just have questions.
I know.
But like, why?
I have one.
I'm like, even me, I even brought bags.
I spoke to you. Like
I smiled so nice.
And still, you can't see me because you can't see yourself. So it's hard to live in the world and not lose shine. It's like, I want to defend my shine.
How has having a daughter changed the ways in which you practice your feminism? Has it made you feel that you have to be urgent in the way that you approach it? Are you gentler? How has it changed?
I think she was sometimes gentle. Her name is Nyamika, so she goes by Mika for short. And she was telling me that some of the teachers at her school call her Mika. And she's telling me the story, and I can hear her putting it back in her mouth right away because she hears my action mode happening immediately. I was like, they said what?
They call you who? And you say what?
And she goes, I correct them every time, Mama. So all the kids in my class, they used to say Mika, now they say Mika, but some of the teachers still say Mika. And she started telling a story, giving one example, and she's already starting to be like, in general, because she's already like, oh, this lady, I put her in fire.
She's like, not always.
And then she's like, and I was like, first of all, and the next time someone calls you Mika, you ignore them. She goes, but then that's rude, Mama. I don't want to be rude. And I'm like, no, they didn't call you. They called Mika. There's no Mika. And she's like, no, I think that's rude. And she's very firm. She's like, I don't want that person's bad thing to become something that I own. Now I must be the one to become bad when I don't want to be a bad person. I don't want to put any. She says I don't want to live negative energy. What happened was not great, but you know what? It's cool. So I was like, nope. I'm gonna write an email to that school and I'm gonna tell them you pronounce my child's name correctly. You say that you don't speak to her at all. And then she's like, but if no one ever speaks to me after this, and she's like playing it on her head like, my mom. My goodness, I know her. Why would I tell her the story? But then also now I'm like, But for me, I had to explain to her, I said, for me, it's very simple. I don't want you to be now 18 and becoming woke and being like, I had to learn that some white women are not going to bother to learn to say my name correctly. So I have to learn that I can value you as a person, and I can expect not the same relation, because you can't even do so basic a thing as to learn how to say my name correctly, even when I correct you. And I was like, I don't want that to be normal for you. And so I know that I understand that you're just trying to live your life, be in that school, and
just mind your own.
And I'm always just messing with your flow there. But
it's important.
But for me, I don't want you. I want you to know that this is your name and this is your person, and you deserve for the people who meet you to understand that they are meeting you, and that you are a person who is made of everything, made of magic. And if they don't have the nerve to know your name, they no.
And to misname you, right? And there's such a violence in misnaming people. It's such a violent thing to do.
And the person is correcting you, and you're like, okay, Mika, and you're like,
and you're like, but.
No.
So I have a thing with my surname. I'll tell you the first time that it's Cele.
Yeah.
Then I'll wait for you.
And then you wait.
Then you're gonna say whatever you say, and then I'm gonna look at you. Then I'm gonna say no, it's Cele. And then you're like, it's so hard. I'm like, but it's 4 letters. I'm really struggling to understand.
Really
and you can really try, because I also think there's certain.
People are like, oh no, the clicks.
They're like the clicks. I'm like. What clicks? There's no click. It's a C. I'm just like, you can't even, have a respect for the phonetics in my name. And it's such an important thing to not allow people to misname you. Because those are the same people who turn around and correct you for saying an English word wrong without batting an eyelid, right? They are the same people who turn around and be like, that's actually not how you say Tchaikovsky.
Yes.
And I'm like, so you can't say Cele when there are 500 Celes. But Tchaikovsky, that you're probably never going to encounter in your life, is a priority to pronounce. So I actually want to talk about literature. So you were, we had such an amazing conversation. African literature, right? You have a book coming out, and you are a raging poet. Why do you write?
So I have a collection of poetry happening, and I can't even believe it, because I don't even know if so my Twitter handle is Raging Poet, but I didn't know I was a poet until even I said to Sarah, I said, oh my gosh, people might describe me as a poet, which is weird, because
it's a thing. Danai, I just want to put it out there. It's a thing.
Oh my god, because it feels like a huge responsibility, and it feels like a person has to be super fancy to call themselves such a thing. So for me, the collection came out of a place where I had, for me it's like there's something in my stomach, and then it happens, like I'll be like in my dreams, or I'll be like swimming, and then these words will arrive. And I think it's been because I have been trained so well at doing intellectual work, even though a lot of my work is a lot about what we feel and how and actually more and more I've been thinking more and more about intuition and about how to bring oneself as a body, as a person who's a spirit, as a person who's not just I've been trying to dismantle my own intellectual, where everything is the mind at the cost of everything else, as a general practice for my own healing. But it's actually difficult for me because I can explain a difficult experience and write an academic book about marriage practice and not talk about the pain of ending a marriage and starting and ending a marriage, because it's of course difficult. Or I can talk about a difficult relationship with someone I care about, like a friend, or a parent, or a lover, and I can intellectualize it for you. Be like, this paper is based upon research on the end of blah blah blah. But to do so for me, the writing in the form of poetry gives me a place to suspend some of my cleverness and also make space for a friend of mine who read one of the first drafts of it was like, he felt pain throughout the collection. He felt pain, not as in it's all painful, because some of it's really, I'm also quite funny. Some of it is funny, some of it is sexy and interesting, some of it is like passionate, some of it is clever.
Which is important, because we're not one thing, right? So I think black women, and always make this example, you're either Kanye Lomo or you're Kanye Mbao. There's no room to be
all of those ones.
You can't be all of those things. You can't inhabit all of those different spaces. Like, we can't have feelings and be sad but still be badass and get up and do things. And it's really important for us to start having that kind of conversation, right? Because black women have feelings too, and it's crazy. I didn't think that I'd spend my adult life trying to convince people that black women have feelings too.
People will treat you like you don't have, because now you're the one who's mad at the staff meeting, so the assumption is you don't have feelings. I'm like, no, my anger is also a feeling, but that's not the only feeling I'm having.
Just because I'm not crying and not fragile.
To feel the optimism, to be that people might actually hear what you're saying and be like, no, I'm still a black woman, they didn't hear what I said. So it's also devastating. I used to always be like, go to a conference and then something racist crazy happens, and then I'm angry, and then I'm devastated. And I used to had this friend who was always like, but why did you ever expect white people to see you? What's wrong? Like, there's something wrong with you for
wanting to be seen.
And I really had to get over it, over that optimism, to be like, this is not about me. This person can't see me as a person. I function as I bring a few ghosts into the room. I bring a few of their own anxieties about gender, about race, about whatever, but I don't exist to this person. So why am I mad about something I knew already? I had to really learn that. But the collection's called Feeling and Ugly, because I was like, not only is it feeling, but also I don't like how people are afraid of ugly feelings. There's something about feelings like jealous. I have a poem, Jealous. It's like thinking about, like, when you feel jealous about like someone, like, I want that love and that person has them, why are we not allowed to talk about it? Like, why is it that feeling that you're taught, like, when you're young, that
it's a bad
nice
feeling,
girl doesn't act out, think of all the like high school movies, like the one who's jealous is the mean one.
Maybe she's just human.
And then she's got low self-esteem, that's why she's no, I'm not having low self-esteem, my self-esteem is fine, I'm feeling jealous.
And maybe not everything is self-love, maybe self-love is not the panacea to all of our problems.
I'm like, you know what, sometimes I want what I want and someone else has it and I also still want it, I covet, and it's an action, and I let me defend my coveting, so it's,
let me defend my sadness without there needing to be a national paper on the sad state of black women in this country.
To make people happy. Like, let me be happy about shit that doesn't make sense.
Like,
let me be happy about.
Can I be happy? Right?
Stop telling me not to be happy about it. I'm happy. I want to bottle that feeling and sell it to others.
Your daughter is gonna see black superheroes for possibly the first time in her life.
Dark-skinned, like, natural haired, like
bold.
Would be like,
women who look like her, right, and who don't necessarily look like the ideal that is maybe one drop away from whiteness. You know,
when my sisters and I, when we were young, we used to play this draw beauty pageants. And just think about, like, this is a world that my child doesn't have to grow up in. We because we saw so few representations of black people in the media. So even a beauty pageant. Now I'm drawing 12 characters for a beauty pageant. I draw a diversity of white women. This one has orange hair. This one has yellow hair. This one has brown hair. This one has green eyes. And then there's one brown person and one black. I was like, how did I learn that you always have the one or two minorities in a white world? And that was... I grew up in I went to schools with other black children. How on earth did we live in a world where my imagination
that was normal
for me to draw a beauty pageant? And I don't think there was. I remember fighting with my sister about like being like, I think black girls should also be allowed to win sometimes because we used to judge each other's pageants. and you, because you've been told the face of beauty has blonde hair, blue eyes, you're having to justify why did you draw this one in the first place? How did she even get into the competition? And then how could she ever win? That's not realistic.
And your daughter's growing up in a world where Lupita is the most attractive woman in the world, and we're not having a discussion. And even your racist auntie is just having to accept that. Listen, Lupita is here to take it all.
The auntie who the aunts who always like we're like we don't why is your friend dark skinned? You're like, can you calm down?
Maybe you're dark skinned too. Like, girl.
I mean, because always the darkest skin auntie who's like the one who's like, yes, we don't, and like because kind of I grew up around like so many kinds of. I think that's also why I started my family. I was like, wait, like how do we have love? What I've learned about love is also this kind of cruel, cutting comment, and of course I'm like, this person doesn't want to hurt me. So even when I write about this in the introduction to this academic book, where my grandmother was saying, don't beat her to my ex-husband at my wedding. And she kept repeating it because the more drinks she had, the more she's like, don't, I love her, don't beat her. And so part of it, when I think about it, is like she thinks obviously I must deserve to be beaten. So she's like, I know she deserves it, but just don't do it. But also, it's also what she understands of what marriage creates as conditions. So now you've married her, which means you might think you're entitled to beat her, and I'm just begging you not to do it.
So for conflict resolution, like.
Yeah, so she's inherited a knowledge that is meaningful to her, and she's articulating that knowledge, and she's acting in it's an act of love that she says the statement. But of course I'm like, why on earth are we talking about beating me? And I'm so for I think a lot of my thinking and writing, it comes from thinking, how do I love what that situation is? How do I take her action as one that it comes out of a sense of resistance to a system that she knows well, a sense she's observing a problem, she's made a judgment, she's trying to protect her grandchild, but also this is what she knows, this is how she knows it. And then still say, I don't agree, because why are you bringing beating into the room? You know what I mean? So yeah, it's like...
How did you fall... Do you remember the moments when you fell in love with words?
Do I remember the moment?
Is there a book that was the aha moment for you, where you read that book and you...
When I read A Question of Power, I always say the phrase, Bessie Head, I nearly lost my mind. It took me. It was like dream worlds that I'd seen in my own dreams. It's not pretty. It's something to read. It's hard. It's like a nightmare. But there was something about what I read that the first time. I remember thinking, it would change my life. When I read Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, the very first page, and I thought about the taste of a pear, and was it peach, and I thought of my grandfather's orchard, and when something hits you, like it's your personal memories, but it's not your personal memories, and it's your personal body, but it's not your personal body, and it's your own feeling of like leaking, and there was something about about Their Eyes Watching God also. I think I remember reading that and thinking, I want to write a novel one day, because I want to bring this to someone else's life. What she's given me is something I want to give somebody else. She people who write in ways that who've made me feel like I make sense, like I'm not insane. Like I think that was one of the first, between those two, like sort of things that smacked me in the face, and then I knew that there's something about writing that I can't ever not have a relationship with.
Is there a book that you wish you'd written, that you read and you're just like,
Living a Feminist Life for me. I know some people have struggled with the way that Tara Ahmed writes, and the fact that she repeats herself quite a lot, and not repeating the same sentence, although sometimes, but there's something about, I love the risk that she takes in her writing, in the sense that she like I feel like I want to write about this table, and then she'll say it the first time, and she's still working through, but she'll put it out there, and then she'll say, okay, the reason that table is really interesting to me, I think it's because of this. So she doesn't let her, this thing, I have a hard time letting go of work, because I'm scared of the judgment, but she's like, take it or leave it, I'll revise later, nothing is finished, nothing is complete. And I think when she finally wrote that book, and my reaction to it, I mean, I want to write the kinds of books that can do academic work, can help us, but also the kind of books that can slice you right open. I think that I think we need more academic writing that slices us open, that draws us into places that draw us out of into action. And I think so I think we need more of, and that's a book that I was like, oh.
What do you think is the greatest compliment that someone could pay you about your writing, or that you've been paid, that you still go back to? When you're having a bad day and imposter syndrome threatens to
I'm terrified
take
of this poetry collection going out, because I'm like, oh my gosh, what if people hate it and think that I'm an imposter and I'm a fake? Like, why am I trying to fake being a poet? Can I just focus on writing about other poets? About poets as an academic, just be a real academic who writes about other people's work. So I'm terrified of what will happen in May when it comes out, and then people are exposed to me as a writer in that way.
And that vulnerability.
But I think, for the friends of mine who've read it, I like to watch, and I think that for me the greatest compliment has been to see someone sliced open as they read it, and I think that would be the kind I want to slice you open. If you tell me you were sliced open, I'm gonna be really happy about it.
Note to self.
Now, if you're not sliced open, then that's fine.
On the 31st of May,
I'll just go back to like analyzing other people's work in a very clumsy way.
Do you feel that imposter syndrome sometimes hinders your work?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's like, have I done all of the due diligence of academic, like, citation or method? A lot of stuff I throw away, and I kind of confidently do. I'm like, I don't want to deal with an infrastructure of white studies in sometimes, for example, I want to write journal articles where I might leave out white people as an audience. As in I'm writing about, I've just written something called Knowing from Loss. If I'm writing, and I'm writing in a journal that isn't embedded really in the worlds I'm in. So there's lots of explaining context, but also I want to write in such a way that if I'm talking about the loss as a point of beginning for knowledge that Black people might engage with, but not as only simply negative force. I want the people who read it, even if it's within an academic language, to get what I mean. I know what she means, like, and not in it like I'm writing about something obvious, but I'm writing in a language and in a world that connects, that isn't saying, let me explain to, like most of what academic discourse is like, so I'm going to explain to an imaginary white audience what these Black people are doing.
And why it's important that they're doing that.
And so I think for me, it's like, so of course, when I write that way, when I get review reports, I'm always asked to explain things. I'm trying to write a paper on this also about, I've heard a colleague say, why are you so opaque? That's what he said. And I was like, why can't you just be simple? And I'm like, because to simply observe that Black women have done this, for me, doesn't answer the question. I'm more interested in the contestations of what's produced, which means it's not going to be a neat narrative, but the form of the narrative will do its own work. Sometimes the form of my writing slips outside of this kind of clean sort of describing things. It's like, no, actually the actual way I'm writing it is part of the performance of the argument, you know what I mean? Which is and then I have to deal with, someone once was like, I don't like the English, this person's using so many complex ideas, but even the English is not good enough. And so yeah, right. And I'm like, no, you don't understand the ideas I'm working with, because I'm not talking to you, so you're the wrong reviewer. But also I'm not trying to explain someone's life to you. I'm trying to use this example to make a different, so this thing, there's a kind of mode of explanation that we practice in academic writing that's always about explaining. Let me explain African literature to you, and I'm like, I could demonstrate an argument about form and object, the separation of object and subject that some forms of literature don't do, and I can perform that gesture through poetry. I heard a colleague apparently at a workshop last week said having poetry in academic scholarship is a dumbing down of the academy, which is shocking.
That is quite.
But also, I'm just like, only a person who has no poetry
in them.
You know, one of my know the clever people with their poetry in their hearts. I must actually put that up on Facebook and be like, I mean you. I mean, I this is somebody I care about and like a lot, but I'm like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I'm sad for you. How can you not know poetry? How can you not think about...
How can you not appreciate...
what poetry can do to express deep ideas in ways that also attend to the little ideas, in ways that also slice open our assumptions. It's just like deep deconstruction done in art. You know, I'm sad for you, but I'm also like,
I'm really sad for that person.
Yes, I'm sad for you.
I'm sad for them and sad for the people around you that you teach.
To say.
What are you reading at the moment?
What am I reading? I'm reading Kindred, Butler. With a friend of mine, we're reading it together. And then I'm starting to prepare for I'm teaching Black Boy in a couple of weeks, Richard Wright. So I'm going to put that up on my shelf today. Start reading that on my flight tomorrow, because that's the next novel I'm teaching. I'm teaching some really cool stuff.
So what are you teaching?
I'm teaching Collective Amnesia later. I'm teaching Simon
That's
and
pretty cool. That's
I'm
pretty
teaching
awesome.
Hala, Osman Sembene. And I'm teaching Black Boy. That's things I've left. I taught Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl.
How do you choose the books that you...
So we have some selections that are in the set. It's a set curriculum, and then if you want to make a change, so Collective Amnesia is new. We used to just teach...
Shout out to Kollega.
Yes. We used to teach just oral poetry, and then I was talking to a colleague last year, and I was like, I think students would get more out of a full collection, and also there's a moment in South African poetry that so many beautiful collections are coming out that we need to start mapping this and having students become articulate and sort of talking about what it means to do a collection, as opposed to thinking about many poets, you know, to respond to a collection, to write about. So, and then I thought, why not do this wonderful, I really love the collection, and
such a way.
I think I'm gonna have such joy teaching it.
To be a student,
yes.
I would happily come. And not just because I love Kollega, but because I think that there's a place for literature in whatever field you find yourself in.
Exactly.
I think that even as a doctor, I believe that there's a place for literature and there's a place for words. And I'm reading a book now, When Breath Becomes Air. And Paul, he's a neurosurgeon who then finds out he's got terminal cancer and. But prior to becoming a neurosurgeon, he studied literature. And he had a master's in literature. And just the articulation of certain ideas is made so much more profound by the fact that he has this appreciation for words, right? And when he describes telling patients about terminal illnesses, just makes me feel that there's a place for literature in whatever. I think we tend to think like, oh, BA students to one side, doctors and accountants and engineers,
Absolutely agree with you.
and STEM students to whatever side. But I don't think that feminism and the ideals that we hope to live out allow us to live our lives in such discrete silos, right? It's like that if you're someone who has an understanding of language, you understand why even medical language can be violent, and why eugenics as a field exists. And I think that it's such a pity that people outside of the like disciplines of literature or African literature don't get to experience.
Absolutely.
I think there's a place for words, and
I mean, all of the things, I remember all of my biology thinking, this is all narrative. It's all narrative. It's the act of the imagination. And then that builds what we call science. I mean, can you imagine how incredible it would be to have the skills to think of it that way and to read it that way? I mean, yeah, I absolutely agree with you.
So we're quite excited for your first anthology of poetry. You should be too, because it's going to be great.
Like a disaster, and I'm like, and I once wrote poetry.
I say this all the time because all these brilliant Black women that I interview, and I've been fortunate to interview quite a few, seem to always have a hesitation about their work, and it's not a hesitation that I think any mediocre white man in his life will ever experience. And I think part of the work for ourselves will be creating a generation of women who know that they're badass without any hesitation, right?
Like, why am I apologizing?
When it comes down to it, you're pretty badass. Like, you've read your own work, we've read your work, we think you're great, and the fact that you can bring those ideals out even in academic writing, which can be bland at times.
I know. I was thinking when you read something, you're like, wow. I actually marked someone's thesis and I was like, this was great, but I feel bad, like this person has no joy. Like, I think joy should be in our writing, even when it's like a journal article. Where's your joy?
Where is your joy?
Yeah.
And it's an act of revolution, I think, for Black women particularly, to be joyful in a word that rejoices so much on depriving us of our joy, so the fact that you can't just walk out with your afro without, on a good day, your fro's out, your edges are did,
yes,
and someone has to comment,
like, you're like, touch your ears. Some woman in my child's school just touched my hair one day in a conversation, like it was safe to do, and I was like, clearly I'm projecting a sense of safety for you because you
she touched your hair just casually
without me hurting you and your body.
You needed to break out into Solange.
I was literally in so much shock that when your time freezes, and I was like, so messing with my joy that day. Oh, and my hair was blue or something. Yeah,
you were just giving life.
I was giving life, and then she touched me. So I was like,
and you're like, but don't.
I just want to have joy. I don't want to be that person who there's a school meeting because one parent and another parent,
or always having to be, now we're always having to explain to people or correct people as to why their behavior is not right, because people just don't want to act right. Like, you couldn't just let me and my fro be.
No, I just wanted to live my life.
Now you're within, you're feeling my roots. What are you doing? Yes. Oh no, baby, what is you doing? With that being said, and we'll end it off with that. I should actually play out with Solange. I'm going to get Solange to play. Don't touch my hair. Don't touch my anything. Yes. But it's been such a pleasure to have Dr Danai on today's episode of The Cheeky Natives. It's been an education in feminism, in literature, in all things Black girl magic and slaying. And we really look forward to having your anthology out. We can't wait to read on all things joyful and not so joyful. But we wish you all the best as you go on to this next part of your journey, and we're looking forward to actually having you on the show and discussing your anthology. Yay, first of many. Yes. We must speak these things into being.
Yes, of course.
Oprah told y'all. But with that being said, thank you so much once again, Dr. Danai. And we are going to read a lot of the recommendations that she spoke about. So I think everybody's taking notes. We're here. But also your students are really fortunate to have such an open-minded and such a brilliant mind teaching them. And we can only hope that will be the future for many other Black students coming into the university currently known as Wits.
Yes.
But yes, catch you next week before I say anything controversial. Thank you so much once again.